All right. Can people see that all right? Good.
Yeah.
Okay. So the stuff we wanted to share, we're titling Curation as Misinformation. And we draw on quite a bit of work that we've done before with our group and present some of it here. And so I will jump in and just get us started with a little case. So over the last few decades, the Coca-Cola company has extensively funded and then communicated about exercise science, and particularly about the link between exercise and good health outcomes, like the reduction of diabetes. And they've also really emphasized what is called the energy balance message. And that message is that weight gain and loss is about a balance between energy taken in and energy put out, rather than about any particular thing you might be eating or drinking. So they funded this work, they've communicated this work, they've spent actually $100 million plus on this campaign. And subsequently, a number of scientists and journalists have become very worried about Coca-Cola's influence on these sciences and especially on public health beliefs. So there have been these critics coming out of the scientific community, the journalistic community, but notably, the critics of Coke haven't made accusations of fraud. They haven't made accusations of questionable research practices. There don't even really seem to be accusations that the science itself is bad in any way. It seems the research is fine, which I think raises this kind of interesting question, which is what's wrong with this? It's clear that a lot of people think there is something wrong with what Coke is doing. But why shouldn't they share high quality, independent research on science with a public audience? So this is going to be an example that we'll return to, and it's an example of what we're calling curation. And we're thinking about a pretty broad phenomenon here. We're not just thinking about like a curator in a library or something. So the distribution of information we receive, which facts, which events, which studies we encounter, deeply shapes our beliefs. That hopefully is fairly obvious to you. What's sometimes less obvious to people is that for that reason, true and accurate information can be highly misleading. And one thing we see in industrial misinformation is that industry and political groups use this fact to their benefit. They use curation as a strategy to mislead. Another thing we see is that sometimes even well-meaning individuals curate accurate information in ways that harm belief. And we think on the basis of these observations that curation should be more central in information policy. Information policy tends to talk a lot about preventing fraudulent scientific research, preventing the spread of false or misleading or actively inaccurate information, and much less on the ways information is curated accidentally and purposefully. So this theme draws from a larger project Jim and I have been engaged in, where we've been modeling false belief, misinformation, and general epistemic dysfunction, especially in the sciences, but also in broader communities. And we've done that with a number of collaborators and students who have all contributed to the ways that we're thinking about things here. And I want to just pop them up here for a little credit. So today, what we're going to do is pull out two parts from this larger project. One that I'll call industrial distraction, which considers how industry actors purposely curate scientific information in order to mislead. The other we'll call journalistic selection, which looks at curation by well-meaning actors like journalists and how that shapes belief. And in both cases, we'll talk about scientific information, primarily the curation of scientific information, the way it reaches the public, and how it thus impacts beliefs. But we'll also pull a few examples from politics because our broader project is about different sorts of beliefs. Okay, so let's start with industrial distraction. So this is a propaganda strategy used by industry, and it works by reshaping the public's causal understanding of the world by sharing distracting information to industry benefit. And the Coke case is meant to be an example of this. So Coca-Cola funded and shared all this work on exercise and its benefits, and people were worried about it. And the reason is that it was ultimately a causal distraction. It was real, even useful science. I mean, it's useful to know about the links between exercise and diabetes and exercise and obesity, but its aim and then its ultimate effect was to distract from the harms of Coca-Cola and other sugar-sweetened beverages. So in this paper, Industrial Distraction, which I wrote with David Freeborn, David is a philosopher of science and a modeler at Northeastern University. We try to analyze this kind of industrial propaganda and understand how it works. So how does this kind of curation mislead even ideal learners? And to answer that question, what we do is draw on causal Bayesian networks, which are going to be models of how ideal, or we might say rational individuals learn. And we use them to show how even these ideal learners can be misled by this kind of strategy. So I'm not going to go into the details here, but we use these kinds of things, these causal graphs, and they're meant to represent how some individual might think about the world and its causal structure. So your beliefs about what things in the world cause other things. So each node here is going to be tracking some kind of variable, and then the arrows are tracking how they're related to each other. So in the Coke case, to be a little hand wavy, people might think that the world looks like this. Drinking Coke tends to cause diet-related disease. And so if you think that, on the basis of this, you might start to make choices like not drinking so much Coke. So that is basically the causal understanding people had of Coca-Cola and its effect on health. Then we see this massive campaign by Coca-Cola, and what they're trying to do is introduce another node into the graph, sedentary lifestyle. And so if you reasonably start by thinking, okay, there's this pretty strong link between drinking Coke and diet-related diseases, but then you start to see evidence from Coca-Cola, again, this is real and accurate evidence, that this link is stronger than you thought, that exercise is more tightly related to dietary diseases than you supposed. Assuming you hold everything else fixed in this causal network, what you should do if you're a rational learner with coherent beliefs is to decrease the strength of this other cause. So to think maybe soda drinking doesn't matter as much to dietary disease as I thought, because the main important thing that shapes dietary disease is exercise. So this sort of helps illuminate why this curation strategy is so worrying. They're sharing this good scientific data. In doing so, they manage to mislead rational learners into thinking their product is safer than it is. And what we do in this paper is show how a number of industries have used the same technique and different variations on it to mislead. To give a few other examples, one thing we often see different industries do is emphasize the role of individuals and individual users in some sort of harm of their product rather than the harm from the product itself via the same sort of strategy. So for example, Facebook, or I should say Meta, has widely funded research into how individual users cause the spread of misinformation, but has funded very little research into how their algorithms or the choices on their platforms shape the spread of misinformation. So again, what they're doing is trying to draw a stronger link between individuals and these harms, the spread of misinformation, than the link between the existence of their platform and their platform choices. So a notable thing about these kinds of strategies is that these techniques often fly under the regulatory radar because they don't involve lying or fraud or questionable research practice or even the suppression of unwanted research findings. What Coca-Cola is doing is just funding and then sharing this real science with the public. And so people see that and they often think, well, nothing wrong with that. But in fact, as we see, this ethically acceptable curation can mislead. Now, as I mentioned, we also will mention a few political examples here. So these same techniques are often used in politics, and when they are, it's sometimes in the same sort of way, hard to say why someone is doing something wrong or why what they're doing should count as misinformation. And you also see these cases where the information sharing is really right on the line of what you would want to think of, even as misleading. But ultimately, the goal is to shape the public's causal understanding of the world. So, to make this point, a few months ago, I went to Twitter and looked at recent posts by some political actors. So, here are two tweets from Donald Trump and Elon Musk, both sharing what are more or less accurate versions of real events. Now, unsurprisingly, given Donald Trump's history, there's some twisting of the details. But in this case, a Virginia judge disallowed 1,600 names to be expunged from voter rolls, even though there was evidence that those might be names of non-citizens, because of a law that you can't expunge names too close to the election. In this case, Colorado officials really did find at least a dozen fraudulent ballots. Here are two tweets, both from the right and the left, that were both sharing information about a burned ballot box. Now, again, this was something that really happened in the lead up to the US election. All of this information here about voter fraud or suppression of votes works basically like a case of causal distraction, or what we've called industrial distraction. So in this case, people start off with beliefs like this: legitimate votes are usually responsible for election victories. So people start off with that sort of belief, but then there's an introduction of another possibility that maybe fraudulent votes have an important causal connection to election victories. So if we see a lot of information about voter fraud, some of it false, but importantly, some of it real, just incomplete. And if we're rational and we start by thinking votes are the main cause of, or sorry, real votes are the main cause of election victories, and then we see all this evidence about fraud, we should again decrease our strength and our belief that legitimate votes are causally connected to election victories in the same way. So for years now, many on the right have been arguing that the 2020 election was stolen. But in this case, there was a phenomenon that some people called blue anon, where people on the left also believe the 2024 election may have been stolen. And here we think that this sort of sharing of accurate information may actually help play a role in decreasing people's confidence in what we think of as a traditional picture or understanding of how democratic elections work. Okay, so that's for industrial distraction. Let's also talk about journalistic selection, and again, start with a few examples. So this, I'm sort of popping back to pandemic era for some scientific examples here. This is a Newsweek article from 2021, and if you were online during the pandemic, which I was very online at that time, you will have seen some articles like this. Woman's entire family dies after she hides positive COVID test. So an event like this was, of course, quite a rare one. So there were very few families where multiple people died of COVID, and especially after something where someone did something morally questionable, like hiding her positive COVID test. But this did happen. It was a real event, and it made national news. Here's another story from earlier, from 2019. Polar vortex brought record-breaking deadly cold to the area. So we see news about the weather all the time, but as I'm sure you're aware, we don't see news about all the weather because news about all the weather would be extremely boring. Instead, we usually see news when the weather does something really wild, like a polar vortex or a hurricane, or in the last few weeks, burning down half of LA. And here is one last example of a headline. New data suggests the coronavirus isn't as deadly as we thought. So this is obviously another pandemic era example, but a very early one where a study out of Stanford found an anomalously low death rate for COVID-19, and then it was splashed across national and international news. So at the time, there were a number of other estimates of the COVID-19 death rate that were higher. We now know that the death rate found in the study was inaccurate, that it was too low, but it was a real study and it got an enormous amount of attention. So what's going on in these cases? We know that journalists curate information in all sorts of ways. And in doing so, they're systematically responding to some different sorts of incentives. And one of the biggest is that journalists face these strong incentives to produce grippy, exciting content. And this has always been true, but in an online world, there's even greater pressure to write stories that are clickbait, that are going to draw readers in. And that means the exciting stuff. Now, journalists are also constrained by norms to report true content, meaning that usually they don't just make up exciting stories. Of course, there are exceptions to that. But typically, it is acceptable and even encouraged to report on only the most exciting or extreme events, because these tend to draw readers, because they tend to be novel and surprising, and one thing humans love is novelty. And now, of course, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because this is the definition of newsworthiness. It is not news that Jim is sitting in his office right now, because he sits in his office, most days. But what all these examples we just looked at are meant to show is that when journalists respond to these incentives and they report stuff that's weird, unusual, or extreme, this is a form of curation. It's a form of sharing just some sorts of accurate information. And unsurprisingly, this can be misleading. So in this paper, the best paper you'll read today, we decided to ask what this sort of curation would do to the beliefs of readers. So again, what happens to savvy, smart learners who see news about extreme events, especially. So this was co-written with Jim and also with Aidan Mohseni, who was a student of ours and is now a professor at Carnegie Mellon University. So what we did in this paper was built a different sort of model, and we started with this assumption: events in the world are normal. So we have some kind of distribution of events that looks like what many real distributions look like. And this could represent many different sorts of things. So this might represent the severity of fire season in different areas around the world this year. Or it might represent the COVID IFR estimates from a bunch of different studies. Nope. Or it might represent global temperature fluctuations over some number of years. So we ask, what if we model journalists who take these events and then report just the extreme ones? Oh, sorry, I could do that too. And what we get if journalists do that is a distribution of reported events that looks like this. So what we see here is that the middle of the old distribution is gone. And now events curated for the public are just these extreme ones. So now people are seeing articles where there are very mild fire seasons and very extreme fire seasons, but they don't see any information about things in the middle. So we can ask, what does this do to learners who encounter these events and try to learn about the world in a rational way? Well, first, unsurprisingly, this can distort viewers' beliefs. And again, unsurprisingly, one thing this will do is make extreme events seem more common than they actually are. So the world will seem more variable to viewers and the truth will seem more diffuse. People will think COVID is killing whole families more than it actually does, but also that the estimates of the fatality rate are all over the place, and also that temperatures are sometimes really high and sometimes really low, and also that fire seasons are flipping back and forth and how extreme they are. So that's one thing. Another thing we find in these models, which is kind of more interesting and subtle, um, happens when we move away from the assumption that people learn in an ideal way. So we know in the real world that irrational, normal people tend to pay more attention to information that fits with what they already believe. And what this means is that when we have extreme evidence being curated in our model, this can drive polarization. And I'm going to try to give a little illustration of why this happens. So suppose someone is a climate change denier already, and they think the world looks a bit like this. Temperature events are happening over here. They're generally kind of low in keeping with historic temperature events. They're going to tend to pay attention to data they see that makes sense to them, because that is what humans do, and ignore data on the other extreme. And we find in these models that that will make them tend to double down on their existing viewpoint, so that this one extreme basically ends up looking like the truth to them. A climate change believer, on the other hand, tends to engage with reporting in the opposite way. They tend to trust things that look like what they think the world looks like. And again, they tend to double down on their position. So in this kind of model, when we have this extreme reporting, it allows viewers to hold fast to polarized views of what the world looks like, which in a democracy is not necessarily what we want to do. So we've seen how one sort of industrial technique can curate information in a way that misleads ideal learners. We've seen how unintentional curation by journalists can be misleading in various ways. And I want to give now one more way that curation by industry of scientific data can mislead. And again, I'll start with a little story. So in the early 50s, it was starting to become clear that cigarettes were killing their users, and a number of prominent studies and then widespread reporting led to the first declines in tobacco sales that had happened in decades. And in response to that, 6 major US tobacco firms hired a public relations company out of New York and mandated them to help fight this consensus that their product was killing its users. And what they decided to do was something kind of new, which is to fight science with science. So in their book, Merchants of Doubt, historians Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway document this episode and call what they were doing the tobacco strategy. So the tobacco strategy actually had many different parts, but one thing they did was formed a group called the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, and they ostensibly were just a research group. You know, the story from tobacco was this group just wants to find out if tobacco is actually dangerous, what its effects are on health, what cigarettes do to people. But in fact, it was a propaganda body. And one thing they would do was put out pamphlets with headlines like this: 9 studies find no link between tobacco and cancer. And that would be true. And these would typically be real and independent studies. But they were just failing to mention that 50 other studies had found such a link between tobacco and cancer. So this is something we can call industrial cherry picking. Ooh, come along. There we go. So what this strategy involves is cherry picking real independent studies that happen to support industry views and then sharing them widely. And in this way, what industry is doing is taking advantage of the probabilistic nature of science. So basically, whenever scientists are studying some area relevant to public health, there are going to be some studies that go one way and some studies that go another, and industry is able to cherry pick just those that go in the way they like. And in fact, one thing we see in the Coca-Cola case, I mean, we talked about the distraction aspect of their technique, but another thing they do in creating this distraction is find basically any independent research study looking at the link between exercise and health outcomes and give that a lot more attention than it deserves. Share it widely, send it to other scientists, publicize it, etc. So to study this effect, we again built a model in this paper, How to Beat Science and Influence People. But this time we assumed that we had policymakers who were observing evidence coming out of a scientific community. So that looks something like this. We modeled a network of scientists who were testing some question, something like, is cigarette smoking dangerous or is climate change real? So they're doing tests of the world, they're communicating with each other. And then we model policymakers who see some number of their tests. So maybe they're connected to many of these scientists or just a few of these scientists. So they're seeing some evidence from the world. And then we also introduced to this model someone we call a propagandist. And basically what the propagandist does in this model is observes all the results coming out of the scientific community, cherry picks just those ones that support industry positions, and then shares them to all the politicians. And what we wanted to ask was, would a propagandist be able to mislead policymakers? So as the scientific community comes to hold true beliefs, could they get the policymakers to hold false beliefs just on the basis of this curation and sharing of real independent scientific data? And what we found in our model is that when we didn't have a propagandist, all the observers would eventually believe what the scientists would come to believe. But when we added a propagandist, this process would always slow down, and in many cases, it would reverse. So in other words, the curation of real independently produced data could sometimes completely mislead the public in this model. One thing we did find is that this was generally harder to do when scientists ran studies in these models with larger sample sizes, or what we would intuitively think of as higher quality studies. Because in these cases, there would be fewer findings for a propagandist to weaponize. So in this kind of regime, every spuriously misleading study basically becomes a weapon in the hands of propagandists. And when there are fewer studies like that, there's less that they can use. Of course, as we've seen in the Coca-Cola case, they often fund studies that they can then share as well, but they also just are selecting from independent science. So perhaps a surprising takeaway here, which I think is related to the whole theme of the talk, is just because a scientific finding is real, gathered by real scientists using ideal methods, doesn't mean that it isn't misinformation. All right, so let me return now from this little side bit and kind of move on to some conclusions. All right. So we've been talking about extremity, we've been talking about curation. Notably, a lot of these kinds of curation effects can happen with social media algorithms, especially ones around extreme content, because extreme content is novel and surprising and people like that. But we've also seen that in some cases, people have started shaping social media algorithms so that they specifically select and amplify content with a particular political intent or with some intents to mislead. Now, one place where there has been a lot of attention to curation in the information literature is literature about echo chambers and filter bubbles. So this is work that's focused on the way user choices in social media and also algorithmic promotion have tended to expose users to just some sorts of online content. And the worry is that in these cases, people sometimes see what they already believe because of the spaces they choose or their algorithm. One thing we want to point out is that this problem might be worse than just filter bubbles because of other curation effects, including extremity selection and the way they interact with this sort of process. And again, I wanted to give one more political example. So, right before the US election, there were a lot of anecdotal or limited pieces of information about voter behavior going massively viral. Um, so, we know that from the left, there were a lot of tweets like this. A voter in North Carolina tells CNN he wasn't going to vote, but did when his girlfriend told him if he didn't vote for Harris, she would break up with him. Former White House aide, for the first time in my life, I voted for a Democrat and I voted for Kamala Harris. I'm a Christian American and Republican. I need someone who shares my values. So these tweets were going viral. Sorry, I'll wait on that. But we know that these real events were not giving a full or representative picture of voter behavior because these were extreme events. So not a lot of boyfriends were changing their votes for their girlfriends, probably not a lot of lifelong Republicans switching votes in any election. But we saw a selection of these extremes and then echo chamber and filter bubble effects happening online so that the other extreme never got seen. And that led to a lot of people who had extremely highly distorted pictures of reality. So here's a reaction post to the election. It just doesn't make sense. So many Republicans voted Democrat. Kamala had more people at her rallies. She won the debate. I genuinely don't understand how this could happen. And the same effect on the other side led to similar reactions there in the 2020 election. All right, so let's wrap this up. Curation, the shaping of real, accurate, but incomplete information, can be even more potent a form of misinformation, arguably, than lying or fraud, in part because it often flies under the regulatory radar. In science journalism, science funding, and science sharing, curation is typically seen as less worrying and less of a source of potential problems than the sharing of inaccurate or false information. One sort of interesting takeaway is that philosophers and social scientists have often defined misinformation as false or inaccurate content, but increasingly considerations like the ones we've brought up here are pushing towards broader understandings of what misinformation is and how we should think about what sorts of content can lead to dysfunction and lead to problems. So walking away from this, we advocate a conception of misinformation that ought to be flexible, that ought to be inclusive, and that ought to be oriented towards action. So we should be asking what sorts of content, whether or not that content is itself accurate, stops people from acting in their own interests, and thinking about that content as potentially a form of misinformation. And this also matters to information policy. So some of the most important curators in the modern world are social media algorithms. But when we look at internet policy, especially discussions in government and in the academics who help them about good information policy, again, a lot of it's focused on suppressing or limiting disinformation, limiting the spread of false or inaccurate content. But of course, conversations about these algorithms should focus just as much on how they're shaping distributions of real data, events, information, and studies reaching users. Of course, users are also self-curators, and so norms are needed there too to help. And with that, we will say thank you.